To start our panel on demonstrations, direct action, resistance, and counter-recruitment. Mark Engler is our first panelist. He is an editorial board member at Dissent, a contributing editor at Yes Magazine, and a senior analyst with Foreign Policy in Focus. Mark has served as a commentator for the Institute of Public Accuracy and for the Mainstream Media Project. His new book is This is an Uprising, How Nonviolent Revolt is Shaping the 21st Century.
It's an honor to be on a panel with Medea Benjamin and Pat Elder, so thank you. David Swanson, the organizers, asked me to come today to talk a little bit about my book, which is, the book is here. It's called This is an Uprising. And this is a book about how protest movements work, how they work to create change from outside the formal political system. And it's a book about how using mass protest and nonviolent direct action are a little bit different than some other types of organizing. Now, each of us today is only going to speak for less than 15 minutes, so I can only give you a very brief overview of some of the things that I'm writing about in the book. But I'll be around after the panel. We have some books available back at the World Beyond War table, and I'm happy to talk with folks there. So I wrote this book with my younger brother, Paul, and along with our older brother, Francis, we grew up in Iowa in a family that has roots in the peace and justice tradition of the Catholic Church. My dad was a priest and my mom was a nun. That's the proof right there. And they decided to leave. That's right. They decided to leave the ministry in the early 70s to have a family. That's me on the far left there, rocking the jumpsuit. I want to remind everyone this was the 1970s. And so my parents were supporters of the Catholic worker movement. I give a lot of talks to audiences where no one knows what the Catholic worker movement is. I don't think that's a problem in this room. Many people are familiar, obviously, with the workers. So growing up around the Catholic worker in Des Moines, Iowa, we were exposed to activists who would do dramatic actions in the plowshares tradition. These were actions to protest the immorality of nuclear war, like sneaking onto military bases and trying to disable bombs or war equipment. And these were really risky actions, and when the workers were arrested, they'd often spend years at a time in jail. And on the one hand, I grew up really admiring these people and their ability to create small, intense communities of people willing to make these huge personal sacrifices for the causes of peace and justice. But on the other hand, as my brothers and I started getting more and more involved in politics, we noticed something. We noticed that there wasn't a lot of discussion in Catholic worker circles about whether these sacrifices were really being effective in creating the type of change that we need. People would talk a lot about bearing witness or about speaking truth to power. There's even a saying in the Catholic worker that Jesus never told us to be successful, only to be faithful. And I think that there's a need for us to challenge ourselves on this point. We can't be satisfied with just being in the right, morally speaking. We need to be strategic, and we need to look at how protest movements can actually force change. So as my brothers and I got more and more involved, we became interested in finding people who were organizing to build power and who were forming the movements of the kind of size and strength that we really need to create change. And that led us to a couple different places. One place was to the labor movement. My brothers and I have all worked on labor campaigns. My older brother, Francis, remains a union organizer. And the other place was to people doing nonviolent direct action, but doing direct action that was not meant just to be an individual act of moral witness, but instead people who had a real goal of building mass movements. And a next formative experience for me and Paul related to what the media was calling the anti-globalization movement and what activists called the global justice movement. This movement exploded onto the scene after protests against the World Trade Organization in Seattle in November 1999. I was there in Seattle. I know Medea was as well, and maybe some others here were too. How many people? We got a few hands. Great. Awesome. So, in Seattle, there was a huge protest. Somewhere around 50,000 people were there. It brought together this amazing coalition of union members, environmentalists, family farmers, indigenous rights activists, all opposed to the politics of corporate globalization. And something like 10,000 people did a direct action where they surrounded the convention center and actually shut down the openings of the WTO meetings. Ultimately, the city is clouded with tear gas, and Bill Clinton declares martial law, and this becomes a huge media event. I was in Seattle, my brother Paul was not, but for both of us, this was a very influential moment. And that's because it was very different than the type of organizing that we had experienced before. When we had done student activism around anti-sweatshop issues or living wages on campuses or environmental issues, organizers would have to work really intensely just to get maybe 10 people to show up for a meeting or to come to a protest, right? And we were used to doing demonstrations that maybe got a little two-line mention in the paper if they got mentioned at all. And then all of a sudden, this protest in Seattle exploded into the headlines, and the political climate totally changed. People were flooding into activist meetings. Hundreds of people said that they were willing to go to jail. There was all of this energy that seemed to break the rules of traditional organizing. And that was all very exciting. But within a year or so, it all fell apart. The energy was gone, and that became a very disorienting time. We were trying to figure out what had happened and why did that happen. And at that point, Paul went to work as an organizer in the labor movement. I was working as a journalist, writing on international trade, on labor issues, on Latin American affairs. And this experience that we had sort of went onto the back burner. But over time, we started to notice something. Every once in a while, these moments of mass revolt would happen again. It was not a one-time thing. So there was another explosion of movement activity around the Iraq War in 2003, which I think most people here were probably a part of. And then there was another explosion around immigrant rights in 2006 when millions of people took to the street in Los Angeles and beyond. Then there was a full year of explosions in 2011 with the Arab Spring and with Occupy Wall Street. And now we're seeing it again with the movement for Black Lives. And one thing we noticed is that every time one of these things would happen, the media would treat it in the same way. They called it spontaneous. They called it unplanned. They called it emotional. They called it uncontrolled. They said it was a once-in-a-lifetime event. But once we started looking, we saw that these once-in-a-lifetime events were actually happening all the time. The same year as Occupy, there were mass protests in Spain and in much of Europe. Then there were huge demonstrations of students in Quebec and in Chile. There were eruptions in Mexico, in Turkey, in Brazil, in Hong Kong. And we started to think, why aren't these accounted for in our vision of social change? Why don't we understand these as part of how our societies progress? Why are we always taken by surprise? And then we noticed another trend. It wasn't just the media or the public at large that didn't really know how to handle these eruptions. It was also true in the activist world. Many of the organizers that we most respected from the world of labor and community organizing actually didn't have much to say when these moments, these explosions of revolt would break out. And in some cases, they were even very dismissive of them. They said, you can't rely on these things. They don't build up organization. They flare up and then they die out. Because of that, they sort of chose to ignore these outbreaks. And as a result of this, we saw that there was a gap between the worlds of what we call structure-based organizing on the one side and the world of mass protest on the other. Now, in the world of structure-based organizing in unions and in community groups, the techniques and methodologies are very well mapped out. There are books like Rules for Radicals or the Midwest Academy Handbook, all sorts of guides for how to organize in that model. But the dynamics of mass mobilizations were much more murky and mysterious. So we thought, well, what if we don't treat these things as flukes? What if we really study their dynamics? What if we get to the bottom of how to sustain outbreaks of revolt when they happen, how to harness their power, and maybe even how we can create uprisings from scratch? And this book grew out of an investigation into all of those issues. Now, given our time today, unfortunately, I'm not able to do much more than give this kind of very broad introduction to the issues that I'm talking about. But I do want to make one final point, which is that when we understand the differences between some of these organizing traditions, between some of these different approaches to creating social change, it allows us to evaluate all sorts of issues in new ways. It affects our understanding of when it's appropriate to use tactics that might be polarizing or controversial. It affects our decisions about when we need to have very specific technical types of policy demands and when it's more important to be focused on cultivating a wide sense of moral injustice that the broad public can see and relate with. It affects our ability to measure the impact that social movements make, to understand why mass mobilizations are often considered failures, even when they're actually having very significant effects. Now, I know that there are a lot of social movement theory nerds out here. I'm not alone. So if these are questions that you've thought about yourself, that you're thinking about in your work, I'd love to talk more either in Q&A or after this session.
All right. Our next speaker is Pat Elder. He is the director of the National Coalition to Protest Student Privacy. To protect student privacy. That would be a very different. A group dedicated to halting the military incursion into U.S. high schools, and also serves on the coordination committee of the National Network Opposing the Militarization of Youth. He is also an author of a soon-to-be published book on military recruiting in the United States.
Countering military recruitment in the nation's high schools confronts an ugly mix of a distinctively American brand of institutionalized violence, racism, militarism, nationalism, classism, and sexism. It confronts the greatest problems in American society. I'll spend a few minutes on the despicable public policy involving tens of thousands of American government employees, both in and out of active duty, whose job it is to persuade high school children to enlist in the armed services. It is extraordinarily deceptive and reprehensible psychological pursuit. Then I'll discuss the military's vulnerabilities in this realm and ways that you can and should exploit them. Why should we be concerned with military recruiters chilling with kids in the high school cafeteria? Well, for starters, it's not a volunteer force. It's a recruited force. These statistics are never mentioned in the corporate military media. Listen to this. 40% of Army enlistees never complete their first term. Imagine for a moment the emotional suffering endured by those who really don't volunteer in the first place. There were more than 20,000 deserters in the United States Army alone from the period of 2006 to 2014, and that's only half of our active service. Half of 770,000 active duty soldiers who were polled 2 years ago said they have little satisfaction in or commitment to their jobs. This is a travesty. Musculoskeletal injuries in the military result in 2.2 million medical encounters a year. Now, talk about pain. Nearly half of the 1.6 million veterans of the United States wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have filed injury claims. Military suicides are at an all-time high, or at least close to it. And sexual assaults are also near record levels in the military, despite a propaganda campaign to try to convince you otherwise. Now consider DD Form 4. Man, these guys they've got acronyms and numbers for everything. It's the military's enlistment agreement. And it says, laws and regulations that govern military personnel may change without notice to me. Such changes may accept my status, my pay, allowances, benefits, and responsibilities as a member of the armed forces, regardless of the provisions of this enlistment agreement. What in the hell are we allowing to happen here? It's an outrage. These poor kids, they're screwed. They're red meat for the corporate and military carnivores who produce contracts they can't understand, contracts that go on to rule their lives. High schools teach Chaucer rather than crucial life skills. The Pentagon's greatest asset in the schools is the JROTC program. JROTC, the Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps. We've all heard of ROTC. They've got a junior component to it. Over 500,000 children, an all-time high, are indoctrinated into military culture in the high schools. 40% who complete the program enlist in the armed services. JROTC is the center of military intelligence gathering in the high schools. The Pentagon embraces the seductive power of the trigger as a recruiting device. Our greatest mass murderers play video games, and the video games desensitize them to murder. And that's exactly what the Pentagon is doing. The Pentagon is using video games to desensitize youth, to teach them to kill. And they're doing it through our schools, and they're doing it through recruitment offices, and they're doing it through an America's Army video game, which is one of the most popular games in the world because it's free. It's rated teen blood violence, and it's sponsored by your government. And most of us allow it to happen, I think, because we don't know it's happening. 2,400 high schools have marksmanship programs. They allow shooting, and they're affiliated with the JROTC program and the congressionally chartered civilian marksmanship program. The kids regularly attend tournaments sponsored by the NRA. Schools allow shooting to occur during school hours in classrooms and gyms that are contaminated by lead fragments fired from CO2 rifles that become airborne and are deposited on the floor and at the muzzle end and the target backstop. Kids track the lead throughout the school. Custodians sweep the lethal material. Loose enforcement of these regulations creates a health hazard for students and custodial staff. JROTC guns fire a .177 caliber projectile, compared to a .22. It goes 500 feet per second. Shot at the eye, it'll go halfway through the human brain. It's a lethal weapon, and the Army categorizes it as a lethal weapon. They're fired in classrooms here in the District of Columbia, in Fairfax County, and in Montgomery County. In classrooms. And then they break for class and new kids come in. And they're fired in gyms regularly. While classes are often taught by military retirees with no college education. We had to bomb Hiroshima. It saved 1 million American lives. They haven't been reading Gar Alperovitz or Peter Kuznick, apparently. We helped Cuba gain their independence. Come on, this is 500,000 kids are being taught this. The CIA, quote, partook in the overthrowing of the government of Salvador Allende. The United States government thought Allende was not favorable to our national interest. This is what they're teaching ninth graders. It's accurate. Okay, Gulf of Tonkin. Those damn North Vietnamese. The U.S. set up a democracy in South Korea after World War II. You get the idea. Make America great again. Sorry. The unit on citizenship is entitled You the People. I'm not making this up. I learned We the People. But this is the military teaching our kids civics, and so they call their unit You the People. You the people. Get in line. Why are we allowing this? I think it's because most of us don't know what's going on. The most sought-after data the military extracts from the schools pertains to a child's cognitive abilities. It's the data the Pentagon can't purchase outright or find online. And it is gained through the deceptive administration of the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, ASVAB, to 700,000 kids in 12,000 high schools every year. The ASVAB is a 3-hour enlistment exam masquerading as a career exploration program, and it tests a child's verbal and math abilities along with knowledge of general science, electronics, auto, and shop. The recruiters are calling these kids up after they take this test and say, dude, you did really good on the battery stuff. I got a job for you. ASVAB results are the only student information leaving America's classrooms without parental consent, a violation of FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. ASVAB data is so valuable because it allows the Pentagon to analyze a child's cognitive abilities, something that they can't buy and they can't find online. They can't find it on Facebook. I mean, these guys are good. They know that a guy's girlfriend doesn't want him to join. They know everything about these kids. Now they know if they can do polynomials or not. Okay? Appeal to, okay, now that's the first half. The second half of what I have to say deals with how, what you can do. You can go to our website, studentprivacy.org, for starters. You can also go to the website of the National Network Opposing the Militarization of Youth, which is NOMY, NNOMY.org. And then also Project YANO, YANO, which is Youth and Non-Military Opportunities. But in a nutshell, you gotta appeal to moderate and progressive school board members and state legislators regarding these issues. Demand your school adhere to the specifics of the opt-out legislation codified in the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. Basically, the law says recruiters gets the names, addresses, phone numbers of kids from a school, although parents have the right to request that their kids' info not be sent. High schools are supposed to tell parents, but most don't. Or they bury the information. Maryland, thanks to a group of activists in Montgomery County, has the only law that requires parents to sign a form that asks parents if they want to allow info on their kid going to the recruiters. And of course, most Marylanders say no. It's the only law like that in the country. ESSA 8025 also says military recruiters are supposed to have the same access to kids as college recruiters, not greater access. Typically, military recruiters eat in the cafeteria, while college recruiters meet with select kids in the guidance office. Military recruiters also perform dozens of volunteer tasks in the school. Demand that military recruiters never be allowed to be alone with kids. There have been too many rapes. A 17-year-old child, Michelle Miller, was murdered by a recruiter in Montgomery County, close to here. Demand that counter-recruiters have access to students. The Ninth Circuit, California, says counter-recruiters have a right to offer opposing views. Contact your principal or your school board, regardless of whether you have a kid in school. These are your schools, man. You know, when you're out there protesting and they say, whose streets? Our streets? Well, whose schools? Our schools. That's right, they're our schools. Contact your principal and school board to make sure that student information is not released to recruiters gained through the administration of the ASVAB. In order to prevent the information from automatically being sent to recruiters, your school must tell the military in advance that ASVAB release option 8 must be used for all students who are tested. Option 8 means the military can't use the result to recruit kids. Schools select release options. Maryland passed a law 5 years ago through our activism that makes it so that parents are given the right to give consent. They can't use information they use from the ASVAB in the state of Maryland to recruit kids. That's good. New Hampshire just passed a law, and Hawaii has as well. Make sure that ASVAB testing is voluntary. The Pentagon says it's always voluntary, but a FOIA reveals, and I've been, requesting FOIAs for 8 years in a row now. But there are 6 schools in inner city Miami, each with more than 500 minority kids who make the kids take the ASVAB. Check out the content of JROTC textbooks. Compare them with the regular textbooks. Make a fuss over the qualifications of JROTC instructors. They only need a high school education. In Montgomery County, Maryland, and Fairfax County in Washington, D.C., you got to have a master's after a couple years. Where are the unions? Make a fuss over that. Demand the closure of marksmanship programs. Check out, get a lead sample. Check out to see if there's lead all around. Get counter recruitment information into the schools. Go to NOMI, go to Project Yano, and get this information. Wherever the military information is, get this information. It's truth-based. Stop students from being placed in JROTC programs automatically. What in the hell? Request that JROTC enrollment statistics are given to you, and if they fall under 100 for 2 years in a row, federal law says they have to be closed. Document the lies on your JROTC textbooks, and make sure that recruiters are not regularly occupying guidance offices and that they are not allowed to be coaches, etc. And finally, if a kid is enrolled in the delayed entry program, and 99% of them are who enlist, tell them not to report the boot camp. And tell them to check out Center on Conscience and War or check out the GI Rights Hotline to find out more information about that. Thank you very much.
I'd like to welcome up our next speaker. Medea Benjamin is the co-founder of the women's-led peace group Code Pink and the co-founder of the human rights group Global Exchange. She is one of the 1,000 of exemplary women from 140 countries to be nominated to receive the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the millions of women who do the essential work of peace building. She is the author of 8 books, including Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection.
We don't get a hell of a lot of wins in the peace movement, so I want to acknowledge all the work that people in this room did to get the Iran peace deal, which is such an important step forward, and the best thing that Obama has done as far as foreign policy. And to also call out that I think one of the most vibrant parts of the peace movement, and perhaps not acknowledged enough here, is the pro-Palestine work and the way the boycott divestment movement has just taken off all over the country, has a lot of dynamism, young people, people of color, the way the Black Lives Matter people have embraced the Palestine movement, and with let's see, maybe a Hillary in the White House, it's really going to blow up because she has really attacked that movement, and it's just going to give a lot more energy for those of us involved in BDS. And I also want to give a shout out to recognize that the Women's Boat to Gaza is on its way to Gaza right now with our wonderful Ann Wright aboard. So I want to use this time just as a example of a campaign, and this is a campaign around Saudi Arabia that we're doing with a broad coalition of people. It's a brand new campaign, not even a year old, and we need a lot of help on it. And as I'm talking, Sana in the back there is going to be passing around a sign-up sheet if anybody wants to help us on this campaign. We need ideas, we need energy, we need volunteers. So to give you a sense of what this campaign is about, it really was amazing to me to start looking at the incredible ties between the U.S. government and the Saudi regime. And we realized that we had to do some educational work to get even people within this movement to focus on what are these ties. And education being the main thing, we started out saying, let's do a summit. We did that in March. Raise your hands if you were at the summit. Well, thank you for coming. And the other thing we did was write a book. This book is available out there. I'd be happy to sign it for you. It's the basic primer, a 101 about what every activist needs to know, a peace activist, about Saudi Arabia. I've been taking it around and doing book tour. If anybody wants me to come to your community, please invite me. And we are explaining to people that these ties with the Saudis have spanned 12 different administrations, Democrat and Republican, that we have to recognize that we are in bed with the regime that cuts off the heads of peaceful dissidents, that has no elections for president, no elections for any Congress, that uses the death penalty for everything from homosexuality to the spread of atheism. Any atheists in the room? Yeah, well, you would have a hard time in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabia is the only place in the world where women are still not allowed to drive, where there's a guardianship system that treats Saudi women as a minor from the day they're born till the day they die. That this country is built up on the backs of migrant workers who live like modern-day slaves in a form of indentured servitude that's called a sponsorship system. And that we are arming this regime to the teeth. Just under the Obama administration, $110 billion worth of sales to Saudi Arabia, more weapons sales than we've ever sold to anybody ever, and the majority of it has come under the Obama administration. A lot of it when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. Hillary Clinton at one point in the WikiLeaks cable said, "What are we going to do about the Saudis? They keep funding these extremist groups all over the world." What did she do? She authorized more weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. And right now those weapons are being used on a daily basis to commit war crimes in Yemen. It's the most underreported war that's going on right now. It's left Yemen, a poor country, in a state of absolute catastrophe. And we have blood on our hands because the weapons are coming from the United States, because the logistics is coming from the United States. When they hit schools and neighborhoods, and 1/3 of the targets of over 8,600 Saudi bomb have been civilian targets, they are done with U.S. support, including diplomatic support. Oh, and the other thing is to recognize that one of the reasons we don't hear more about Saudi Arabia is they have bought consent or silence with a lot of their petrodollars. We buy the oil, they make the money, and they put the money into spreading their distorted version of Islam, not the peace-loving Islam the majority of people in this world practice, but their distorted view of Islam, and then they also put the money into buying favorite views from things like major universities, like the one we're in right now, Ivy League schools all over this country, foundations like you've heard of the Clinton Foundation. Got between $10 and $25 million from the Saudis. Even Jimmy Carter's lovely foundation, Saudi money. I was sitting in a hearing 2 days ago listening to John McCain rail against the Iranians, thinking, why does he rail against the Iranians instead of or in addition to the Saudis? And I just Googled John McCain, Saudi Arabia, and realized that he got $1 million from the Saudis for his institute. They spread the money around. There are 8 different lobby groups in the United States, right here in Washington, D.C., that are paid for by the Saudi government, that are paid agents of the Saudi government, and they include ones that have Republicans and Democrats, including former senators, Republicans and Democrats. And here you see a picture of the Podesta brothers. Started a lobby firm called the Podesta Group. You might have heard of John Podesta. He is the head of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. His brother, John Podesta, gets $140,000 a month from the Saudis. It is really disgusting, and we've got to do something about it. So what are we doing? We are trying to build a movement around this. The first thing is educating people around the issue of the weapons sales. There have been 43 different weapons sales in the last 8 years. Normally, Congress just looks the other way and let them go through. But right now, there is more awareness among Congress, thanks to the work that many of our organizations are doing, to say, hey, do something about these weapons sales, block them. And so so we started out with the weapon that has a bad reputation or a worse reputation than some of the other ones, and that is cluster bombs. Human Rights Watch did a great report about how cluster bombs are being used. The United States is furnishing Saudi Arabia with cluster bombs that are being used in Yemen, even though the international community has banned cluster bombs. So we focused on this. There were groups where the factory of Textron, who was making these, they were protesting, like Massachusetts Peace Action. They were protesting at their Delaware plant. Others were protesting at their headquarters. There, at the same time, we were protesting in front of the Saudi embassies, at the U.S. State Department, in front of the White House, and we were organizing members of Congress. And we did a pretty amazing job for a beginning campaign, which is when there was a vote in Congress, it was 202 people against selling these cluster bombs versus 216. So we came very, very, very close. So much pressure that Obama then stepped up and said he was going to put a halt on the sale of cluster bombs, and then Textron in September said it was going to stop the production of cluster bombs. So our next thing became the larger issue of the weapons sales. There was a deal that just as all these reports about the war crimes in Yemen was going out, the Obama administration announced a new round of $1.15 billion of weapons. And so many of us got organized and mobilized and said, let's do something about it. We had great spokespeople in the Senate, Chris Murphy from the Democrats, Rand Paul from the Republicans, and a broad coalition that not only included peace groups, but included a humanitarian community from groups like Oxfam to Mercy Corps to the Red Cross, groups that had never stood up against weapons sales, like Mercy Corps, for example, and it included groups like the American Bar Association, so a very broad coalition. We got organizing, we got mobilizing, and we managed to get 27 senators in the vote just now to vote against it. We lost the vote because there were 71 in favor. One has to scratch your head and say, how much money are they taking from the Saudis or the weapons industry that they would vote for this? But given the way things are today, getting 27 was actually a good start, because there will be another round of weapon sales coming up very soon, and we need to get on the horn and get in touch with all of our Congress people, especially the ones that voted the wrong way this time, and give them hell, do sit-ins in their offices, do protests in their offices, and tell them how disgusted we are that they are authorizing weapon sales to this repressive regime. The other thing we can do is be creative. We have a very creative person right here, David Hartsough, who said, why don't we look at where these weapons are being produced all over the country and do protests at the production site, and why don't we look at where they're being shipped from and do protests from the places they're being shipped, try to stop the shipment of weapons. We also have one company, General Dynamics, that's the one profiting the most from these. We found out that somebody has broken the glass ceiling in the weapons industry. In fact, the CEO of General Dynamics is a woman. So we thought, well, let's go after this woman. And we found out where she lives, actually. We can go and say there's blood on the hands. There's a war criminal living in the neighborhood. We can go to their production sites. We can go to she's on the board of the university, Northwestern University. We can get the students involved and say, get her off the board. We can look at this issue of religious freedom. Saudi Arabia is, every year, according to our Congress, we have a law that says, International Religious Freedom Act, that we will study every year the worst abusers of the most intolerant countries when it comes to religion. Saudi Arabia is the only country in the world where you couldn't build a church. Saudi Arabia is the only place in the world where you could get arrested for having Bibles. Saudi Arabia is the only country in the world where until 2004, you couldn't get into the country if you were Jewish. A non-Muslim, a Shia minority are discriminated against. Every year they come in among the countries, the worst of the worst in terms of freedom of religion. But according to the law, they're supposed to get sanctioned. And other countries like North Korea and Burma do get sanctioned. Saudi Arabia doesn't. Why? Because in 2004, the State Department instituted an indefinite waiver for Saudi Arabia. So if we get together a big coalition of groups, from atheists to religious groups to peace groups, and we demand that the State Department lift the waiver for Saudi Arabia, I think that's something that we could do. We could go to the Podesta group and do protests and sit-ins outside their office and tell them, break the contract and stop taking dirty dictator dollars. So I want to say that there's one other thing that's really, really, really important that we do, and that's to support people inside Saudi Arabia, because people inside Saudi Arabia are risking their lives to stand up to their government. And I want to show you a video that we did of a young man who was arrested as a juvenile, and he was a peaceful protester, a member of the Shia community, and this is what happened to him. This is a video that Code Pink did. So this is an example of something we did, and we put it on the internet, and when we started looking back, there have been almost 4 million views on the internet, and you know where the vast majority of those views are coming from? Saudi Arabia. And we're getting so many thanks, and the parents said the only reason their son is still alive is because of international support. So let's recognize how important it is for us to give solidarity to these people in Saudi Arabia, and how important it is for us to cut our ties with the Saudi regime. And I just want to end on a more positive note, because I feel like whoever is coming into the White House, we know is going to be a hawk. And the movement and the people who were part of the movement under Bush who went away, they're not going to be under the illusion like they were under Obama that things are going to be okay. This movement is going to build. We are going to have hundreds of thousands of people in the streets again like we did before. And I felt it when I was at the Democratic Convention. Being in the Democratic Convention, on the floor of the convention, when all of a sudden, when the former Secretary of Defense was speaking, Leon Panetta, and when General John Allen was speaking, there was a cry coming up from the floor, starting in one delegation, Oregon, passing to Washington, passing to California, and people got up and were chanting at the top of their lungs what I would like you to stand up and chant with me at the top of your lungs. And just think about this resounding throughout the convention when all the war hawks were there listening, and it was, "No more war! No more war! No more war! No more war!" Thank you.
Next, I'd like to call on John Deere, who's an internationally recognized voice for peace and nonviolence. Can you hear? He's a priest, pastor, retreat leader. He's an author of 35 books on nonviolence and nonviolent peacemaking. He's a former director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. He's been arrested more than 75 times for nonviolent civil disobedience. He's been nominated a number of times for the Nobel Peace Prize. And he's a staff member of Campaign Nonviolence, which has groups working all across this country for nonviolence and end to injustice and destroying the environment.
Moving from a culture of war to a culture of peace, right, David?
Yes.
Okay, number one. This is just what I was thinking about, and you've been speaking and reflecting all day, but if Gandhi were here, he'd say, well, why? We don't deserve it. And he scandalized the entire independence movement in India for decades, saying, why should the British give us independence? Until we act like we deserve independence, then we can get independence. So the first step is starting to live and act like you are in a culture of peace and justice and nonviolence. What do you think of that? I think that's a very profound truth. That's everything Michael was saying. That's why I'm just giving you a footnote here. I think about that a lot. How can we act as if we are already in what we want? And that has to mean a radical change in every aspect of life, personally, communally, nationally, globally. We're living now, from this moment on, in the culture of peace and nonviolence. I could start getting biblical on you and spiritual and Catholic, and nobody wants that. No, I'm just kidding you. Jesus would say, the reign of God is at hand. We're living in that. Thich Nhat Hanh would say, you're already living in the pure land. And we're just unpacking, Michael, the social, economic, and political implications of this. And so I'm very challenged by Gandhi's comment. And I think it applies to us in the United States. And Michael unpacked it better than me, but I find that a starting point. Second, therefore, like Michael said, we non-cooperate with every aspect of this culture of war and violence and injustice. We non-cooperate. We do not support the military or injustice or racism or go through the list. We don't send our kids to war. We don't pay for war. We don't go to war. We don't vote for war. We don't teach war. We don't promote war. We don't justify war. We don't believe in the God of war. We don't support the churches and the false religions of war. And all the other implications of violence, and of course I'm talking about racism, sexism, greed, destruction of the earth. We resist the culture of violence and war, including through nonviolent civil disobedience as a last resort. But it's a lifelong resistance. And that's what my friend and teacher who just died, Daniel Berrigan, taught me my whole life. The great poet, Edna St. Vincent Millay, one of our teachers, in that first sentence of the greatest poem, I shall die, but that is all I shall do for death. That is our mantra. And we're talking about death and the metaphors and the means of death as a social methodology. That's what Michael just told us. If we want to be part of a culture of peace and a culture of nonviolence, we are non-cooperating with death. And all of its metaphors and means and implications and systems. Number 3. We practice nonviolence. We have to go deeper than Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Dorothy Day. We have to go beyond them now. Nonviolence to ourselves. Meticulous interpersonal nonviolence toward every human being on the earth. Nonviolence toward every creature. Nonviolence toward Mother Earth. Go deep in it and make the connections. And reclaim our humanity as nonviolent beings, our spirituality as people of nonviolence in a universe created going toward nonviolence, toward a God of peace and nonviolence, toward peace as a spiritual truth and reality. We are talking about practicing personally the peace we seek politically in our lives and expanding that to communities, nations, and governments. I'm trying to unpack this topic, moving from a culture of war to a culture of peace. Number 4, we organize and support global grassroots movements of peace and nonviolence for a culture of peace and nonviolence. We are not powerless. And the culture of war tells us there's nothing you can do, you can't make a difference, you're powerless, who the heck do you think you are? And we go right along with us, even us as activists and movement people. Baloney. We have a power. I'm talking and quoting, like Dr. King said, the power of nonviolence to change the world if we dare wield it as a weapon. We have yet to begun to do that, to go beyond Martin and the movement. We can. If we take our teacher and our prophet seriously, Dr. King. The only way changes happen through history is bottom-up grassroots movements. Jesus was a nonviolent movement organizer. They have to kill him. To Dr. King and Mahatma Gandhi and Dorothy Day. This is what we are about. Well, how are you doing with that as movement builders? We have to be movement builders. And Michael just explained it. The world is moving. We never in history have had the opportunity we have at this moment. 85 nonviolent revolutions in the last 30 years. 2/3 at least of the human race documented now as part of the grassroots movements for justice and peace. It never happened before. The New York Times saying on that day, Michael, remember? February 16th, the next day, we now have a second superpower on the planet. That's us, the movement. There's only being part of the movement now in this dark and difficult hour and so forth. But that means, as we've just heard, we have to connect the dots. It's a culture of death, violence. We can talk, these are words to talk about something we've never experienced before, from race into the total destruction of the earth and nuclear weapons. My group, Campaign Nonviolence, one of our projects we've launched is a week of actions around International Peace Day. This is the third week. This week, we have, as of an hour ago, 758 demonstrations, actions, and events happening across the country in all 50 states. What do you think of that? That's pretty good. We want to have 1,000 next year. Go to our website, campaignonviolence.org. They're all documented. I've never seen this in my life. But what's different is we asked everybody to take the streets against everything. Racism, mass incarceration, poverty, the police killings, to the schools and healthcare and the hunger I see in New Mexico where I live, to war and drones, to nuclear weapons and executions and torture and catastrophic climate change and corporate greed. We're connecting the dots. And also at the same time upholding the vision of a culture of peace and nonviolence. We simply cannot get the media to interested in this at all. We are really working hard on it. But the movement is responding. And that's what I'm saying. Be part of the movements. Build movements till the day we die. This was our hope. Because we have a power. I was with Cesar Chavez of the United Farm Workers shortly before he died. We stayed up all night. And I said to him, if I'm ever with people and they say, what should we do, John? What should I say, Cesar? And he said, tell everybody for the rest of your life, which I have done, I promised him. Like this, he went. Public action, public action, public action. Tell everybody they have to engage in some public action for justice, disarmament, and peace. What do you think of that, Michael? All right. Number 5, one of our programs we've launched is, I got invited to speak in Carbondale, Illinois. And the groups there kind of just came together and said, this isn't working, so we've launched Nonviolent Carbondale. And I said, excuse me? And the longtime activists on all different issues came together and started having their meetings just before the city council meeting. This was years ago. And then they started meeting with the police department. Then they were in inner cities where the worst violent blocks. Then they were in the schools. Then they were in the healthcare. Then their libraries. And what they did was they lifted up a vision of how their city could become a culture of peace and nonviolence. We have 35 cities in the United States working on this, reclaiming their city as how can it be a culture of peace and nonviolence. I think that's an organizing tool that others can use, and I invite you to consider this, and you can go to our website and find that there too, campaignonviolence.org. 6 o'clock, number 6, you're not going this is also difficult. Religion. I'm sorry to bring it up, but I'm convinced of having met tens of thousands of religious-based activists around the world that every religion on the planet is rooted in nonviolence. We have to help all the religious communities in the United States and around the world reclaim their core fundamental truth of nonviolence, which means love, compassion, and peace. No killing. There is no cause, however noble, no matter what anyone ever says to us for the rest of our lives, for which we will support the taking of a single human life. One life. That's a religious principle. Please help that to happen, religions to reclaim their nonviolence. And this year, what I have been working with, which has been a setback for me, is the Vatican. And I don't know if you've been hearing what's happened. Some of us were invited to Rome to meet for a week with the Vatican officials under the invitation of Pope Francis. And we've been continually shocked. We're continuing to work with the Vatican regularly. 3 weeks ago, it was announced through our work that the Pope is issuing a statement on January 1st for the first time since the Sermon on the Mount on nonviolence. But we have asked him to write a formal encyclical like he did on the earth. And we are getting an audience and hearing on this, and movement is happening. This is hopeful. And he's going to, if we can get this to happen, we'll call the world to this vision of a culture of peace and nonviolence. If that happens, and certainly with the January statement, use it. People like Pope Francis right now around the world, and it's a very mainstream way to help us get this vision of a culture of peace and nonviolence into the mainstream. And so this brings me to my last point, number 7. I think, Harvey, wherever you went, one of the casualties of the culture of peace, the culture of war, a casualty of a culture of violence that we're facing is the loss of the imagination, which is at the heart of this topic that you've asked me to say a word on. You can no longer imagine that peace is possible, as Michael said. You ask anybody, can we have a world without war, a world without racism, a world without nuclear weapons? No, no, no. Our job, as Michael said, is to be visionaries of peace and nonviolence and help people to reclaim the imagination for peace and nonviolence. That's what our elders did throughout their lives. And the ones I'm talking about, the movements, because movements are the only way. And the ones I study are the abolitionists. Now, these people are just wacky. They're fantastic. They come along, and this is my imitation of Frederick Douglass or William Lloyd Garrison. Today, we are announcing the abolition of slavery. The people, you can hardly say it with straight. Are you crazy? There's always been slavery. It's in the Bible. Some people aren't people. He said, no. A new world is coming. A new world of equality. And they reclaim the public imagination of what it means to be a human being. And that was the breakthrough that led to the movement. We have to stand on their shoulders. Our job is even harder. And we're going to stand on the shoulders of Dr. King. And that's what we're doing this weekend. And we're saying, excuse me, America. Today in Washington, D.C. at American University, we are announcing the abolition of war. End racism and poverty and greed and sexism and torture and executions and nuclear weapons and catastrophic climate change and every aspect of this evil system of violence. And they're going to say to no, you're crazy, and we're going to say no. A new world is coming. A new world of nonviolence. That's what Dr. King did. I have a dream. We have to be those visionaries of peace and nonviolence too. And then we can build a movement as people reclaim their sanity and their sight from the blindness that leads to killing.